at a high level, we're going to go over how risk scoring can impact your AML KYC organization. We're going to be taking a look at using a holistic risk score to drive your PEP screening strategy. We're going to be talking about tailoring your adverse media processes so it isn't an open fire hose, and also the financial and human impact of these strategy changes. And with that, I will pass things over to Jeff to get started.
So here's what we're hearing from our clients, because Amanda and I consistently spend a lot of time in front of AML, KYC, even fraud folks, and they're being told pretty clearly they have to do more with less. Very rarely do we get to encounter clients that have more headcount than they need, more capacity than they need. Folks are just running very lean right now, and I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. A lot of pressure to automate processes. So as you're trying to struggle with having enough people to get the job done well, that kind of leads you down the path of trying to automate and do things in a cleaner, more efficient process. And then we're finding it's really difficult to hire and retain kind of AML, KYC, fraud team members. We're hearing that pretty consistently with a lot of our clientele, and we'll kind of go into the reasons for that. But it's very interesting. Amanda and I would go to a lot of trade shows, a lot of conferences, and rarely do you hear the human component of compliance teams get brought up. But we just want to say, like, this presentation today will have a human side to it, because we realize it's very difficult to lead a team of compliance professionals who are tasked with doing really difficult work. If you look at it at a high level, compliance people have to keep up with multiple streams of data, sanctions, PEPs, alerts, adverse media, transaction monitoring, doing regulatory reporting. Just a lot of things coming at you from a lot of different angles. The work can be stressful, hours can be long, the workload can be high. And if you miss something, there's the chance that you expose your company to risk. So you put those things all together, and quite frankly, it can be a pretty stressful way to go about business, right? And so we want to make sure what we're talking about today truly has a human component, so that you feel like if I'm leading a team of compliance people, what I'm hearing today helps me in a way to keep them motivated, encouraged, and help them remind themselves of what an important role this is. So kind of what's driving these trends? If this is what we're hearing from compliance, do more with less, automate, difficult to hire and retain. So if you've never looked at Deloitte's kind of CFO Signals Pulse survey, they kind of come out every quarter. It's really helpful because it helps you know what's going on in the mind of CFOs. And the kind of the harsh reality is that compliance oftentimes is seen as a cost center, right? So compliance doesn't generate revenue, it provides oversight for revenue generation. And so as a result, that's kind of how it's viewed in a business setting usually. So right now, what the CFOs are telling Deloitte in these surveys, and the most recent one came out about a month ago, was that cost optimization is their top near-term priority. And so when you hear that, you go, okay, that could make my life harder, right? So the CFO controls budgets. So this is the data I'm allowed to buy, the software packages I'm allowed to buy, the number of headcount I can have on my team. CFO heavily drives a lot of that. They control those purse strings, so to speak. And 54% of them say recently their COO has asked them to launch an overall cost-cutting initiative. And I think what's really driving that is there's just a lot of uncertainty in the world right now. Only 50% of CFOs say they're confident they can control their overall cost, and that's because there's uncertainty with labor cost right now, with high turnover, with trying to backfill people, having to pay bonuses sometimes to get people to sign on, and then those inflationary risk. So we're very much in a market right now where companies are taking a more conservative approach because they're worried they can't control their cost in the immediate term. One of the ways they feel like they can control their cost is with things they see that are more fixed. So when I look at a compliance business, it's fairly easy to predict cost. I've got data that I've bought, I've got software, and then I've got people doing work, and I can largely kind of control those things. And so as a result, it's going to be harder and harder, I think, for compliance people to get the kind of budgets they need for additional headcount, for additional products, for additional data. So you're going to continually just kind of be asked to probably do more with less for the foreseeable future. And you also see a little bit of concern around kind of where the economy's headed. So about 34% of the CFOs say they don't see the North American economic outlook is favorable right now. So that's up 5% from Q1. So what that tells you is there's a little bit of growing concern that maybe the economy is slowing down and could get more challenging, more headwinds that we're facing. So that's what's driving a lot of these trends from like the C-suite. So like the people that set budgets and approve things, this is kind of where their mindset's at. And with us being in compliance, just means we may have some headwinds in getting things done. So perpetually trying to do more with less, that's what's driving that trend there. The other trend that we see, why it's so hard to hire and backfill, and again, this is the human component. There are tons of studies and research out there that kind of break down why do people leave their profession or move from one company to another. And it breaks down in some form or fashion often to one of these four here. Too much workload, feeling burned out, the role feels monotonous, I kind of need a change, or I don't feel a connection to a higher company purpose. You know, compliance can oftentimes check all the boxes here, right? The workload can get heavy. Those sanctions and PEP hits keep coming in, the transaction monitoring alerts. I've got to do that SAR filing with the 100 fields I have to fill out. You know, I feel like I've looked up, Juan Ramirez, I got a hit for that, and I had to look up 32 alerts to figure out if any of these are the Juan Ramirez that I'm looking for. So sometimes it can feel a little, a little rote, little monotonous, and you don't always feel like your connection to what the company's trying to be successful at, what their overarching goals are. So, if you're not careful, compliance can take on a lot of these, and as a result, it can be difficult to retain your top people, and then backfilling them can be very challenging because you're looking for maybe a unique skill set, someone with some compliance background. All these things make it challenging from just a human perspective, and we want to recognize that. So much of what we're going to talk about today, it's about being more efficient, but it's also about giving the folks on your team maybe a higher purpose, higher calling, where they feel like the work they're doing is super meaningful for them and it's helping protect their company, and they're starting to see how all these things start tying together. So you will see a human part to this. So how can risk scoring kind of help with these main trends that we're seeing? So you kind of need to think about risk scoring, the concepts we're going to talk about today. If you think about a visual, like in an emergency room, the way it typically works is there's what's called a triage room. So if you go into an emergency room, there's nurses and personnel in that triage room trying to make an additional kind of assessment of how serious your health condition is. So mainly, let's say you walk in or you stumble in because you've got a broken ankle or you've dislocated your elbow. So you're in pain, but it's not life-threatening, right? So they're going to assess you and sit you aside and say, hey, someone's going to be with you in the next 30 minutes. We'll get you evaluated, but they're kind of doing that initial triage. Maybe someone comes in and they're showing that they've passed out. Someone's almost having to drag them in. Their heart rate's elevated. Perhaps they're having a heart attack. That could be a life-threatening situation. So that triage would say, let's get them immediately back to a doctor or medical staff so we can try to see what's going on. So they're doing that triage to figure out how quickly do we need to have this person seen, and which person can they sit aside and wait a little bit before they need to be seen by medical personnel. That's really what risk scoring is, right? So if you're on a compliance team, and let's say you've got 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 existing clients, how do you know which of those on a daily basis kind of present the most risk to your company? And then how do you prioritize those? So I need to spend more time looking at these clients and these accounts, and I can spend less time on these because they don't pose a greater risk to us. That's really what risk scoring is. It's kind of that front-end triage. And so why, there's a couple ways this can help in your business if you're not doing risk scoring today. It helps with your narrative when you're talking to the C-suite, the kind of the CFOs of the world, where you talk about, here's the size of my team, here's the task we have to keep up with, here's the enormity of the project, and here's what we do. We do risk scoring on a continual basis so that I know which subjects to spend the most time with and those that I can spend less time with. So I'm kind of doing triage of our account base and figuring out if I've got to do more with less. Risk scoring helps me spend more time here, less time there. The other side of that is the human side. The work can become more meaningful. There's a couple ways you can describe kind of life in compliance. You can say, well, my job is I respond to, sanctions alerts and PEPs alerts, and I've got transaction monitoring rules that are getting tripped, and I'm reviewing those, and I'm having to complete kind of SAR reports. that all sounds kind of reactive, like it's just a flow of information coming to you and you're just responding to it. When you have risk scoring, the work can feel far more meaningful. You can say, at any given time, I know the accounts that present the most risk to my company, and I spend the majority of my time looking at those and trying to figure out, do I need to take quick action to protect my company from AML, fraud, KYC risk? That's a different mindset. One's reactive, then when it's reactive, it can feel, it can feel monotonous, tedious, doing the same thing over and over again. When it's risk scoring based and you're always addressing the most critical items, you feel like you really matter to a company. You're on the front lines protecting that company from potential risk, from potential fines. And when fines happen, then typically what happens with a company, they tend to have to lay off people, cut projects, et cetera, because they have to pay that fine out. So you're on the front lines, you're doing risk scoring, your work is more meaningful because every single day you're looking at all your accounts and you're protecting your business in the most efficient, defensible way that you possibly can. So that's why risk scoring is so critical, not only from selling to the C-suite internally, but making sure your employees feel engaged and more meaningful in what the work that there is they're doing, right? So what can drive an overall risk score? Well, there's a number of things, but we've kind of highlighted like 7 of them here that tend to drive your typical risk scoring methodology. So client ID verification on the front end, is the person who they say they are. Obviously, sanctions, government list, that kind of thing. Is there any political exposure, which we're going to talk about in more detail? Transaction monitoring, watching their transactions and looking for irregularities, anomalies that could drive a risk score. Regulatory reporting, so if you're constantly sending out SARs and CTRs for an account, that could elevate their risk score because it could mean they're involved in potentially risky activities. Client provided data, like for instance, the geography, the clients from, are they from Latin America or Asia or United States, et cetera? And then adverse media. And adverse media just means articles that are available in the public space that could recommend there's risk for that client. You're seeing things around articles that show up they're being investigated for financial abuse or for fraud or corruption, or their companies being looked at for bankruptcy. It's anything potentially that's negative about that person or company that you would want to wrap into your kind of overall risk scoring. And again, we'll talk about client ID verification, political exposure, and adverse media, but these are typically the things that drive an overall risk score. And it looks like Ashley may have a question for us.
Yep. What kind of client data do people work into their risk scoring models?
Okay, that's a great question. Yeah. So oftentimes it can be things like the person's occupation, right? So the type of job they do could make them riskier. Where they live in the world could make them riskier. You could have tiers of your client base, right? So the largest, they're platinum, and then it drops down to silver, gold, bronze, whatever it may be, tier 1, 2, 3, 4. So the size of client they are, the size of vendor they are, how important they are in your work stream, how important they are into your internal revenue. All those are like practical examples of client provided data that can be used to drive an overall risk score. But in general, these are in one form or fashion, these tend to be the kind of the 7 elements that drive a risk score. The main change is that number 6 there. It's bringing in the data that you have in your system, occupation, geography. They work with the government, they sell this product, they travel abroad, whatever it may be that you deem as potentially they add more risk to your business, working that kind of data into your system. So that's typically how an overall risk score is generated. So now what we've shown you is, hey, there's these kind of going trends of doing more with less, automating. There's the challenges of kind of leading compliance people in a world where it's hard to hire and retain and keep people engaged. So now what would it look like to actually have a risk scoring methodology in place? So for instance, let's say Brandon Barber is one of your accounts, right? And so when you logged out yesterday, he had a score of 40. His risk level was medium. He would have been one of the 5,000 or 10,000 accounts that you kind of have in your book of business, right? So the question is, how do we know which ones are the riskiest? How do we do that triage? And you see here, Brandon's score went from medium to high overnight. You got a new risk score every single day. The first question you're going to say, okay, Brandon's suddenly riskier to us, but what's driving his risk score? Why is he suddenly riskier now than he was yesterday when I looked at him? And so in your filter, whether it be Alessa or another filter that you're using, you would have kind of your customized risk score for Brandon, right? It could be based on things like where he's located in the world. Are we filing any regulatory reports, CTRs or SARs on him? Did he show up on a sanctions list potentially? Are there transaction monitoring alerts for maybe he's trying to do structuring to stay under regulatory limits, or maybe there's money coming in and out of high risk jurisdictions for Brandon? So you would just kind of, in those 7 kind of factors we talked about, you would build a risk scoring methodology that works for you. And then every single entity that you have in your third party platform would have a risk score. So you see here, Brandon had a couple of changes overnight. He changed locations, and he looks like he had some transactions that came in for structuring in this example. So now you know Brandon's riskier. You know what part of his risk scoring methodology has changed overnight. And then you click through to like a holistic view, because what you're trying to get to in a risk scoring methodology is everybody's got a risk score. It changes every single day, and I get a holistic view of that client. But what you can see there, you get into a workflow where every single entity has a risk score. You build a custom risk score methodology, and then every single day you're watching all of your accounts, and you're looking for those ones that they need to be triaged. There's something where they're riskier. It could be a PEP hit, could be sanctions hit, could be transaction monitoring, could be something that happens in adverse media, but something has elevated them. They get up to the top of your ladder, you look them over, and this becomes a far more efficient way. When you're trying to do more with less, you don't want to sit there and click through hundreds of PEP hits and hundreds of transaction monitoring hits, because you don't know what the most important elements are in all those alerts. But when you have risk scoring, it's always going to show you, here are the clients that present the greatest risk to you. Here's what's changed with them that's made them riskier, and here are the details behind that. Then what do you want to do about it? That's what you're trying to get to as quickly as you possibly can in a system, whether it be Alessa or somebody else. And then ideally, you want a view where you can see holistic risk. So you can see all their financial transactions. You can see the ID verification of what they've done there. You can see if there's any kind of hits for like a sanctions or a PEP hit, showing up in there. You want to be able to see adverse media, which we'll show you later how you can kind of look that up, so you can kind of dig into that. But again, you want that kind of one-stop shop where the risk scoring tells me who I need to look at, who's the riskiest, who's elevated, what's changed in the risk score, and then you get to one kind of general area where it's all stored. And that's the power of risk ranking. So if you don't do risk scoring today, you should strongly consider it, because otherwise you get caught in this typical trap of I'm trying to wade through all the alerts. I feel like I'm being defensive. I'm just trying to clear all the things out of my queue. That's different than my system has been engineered. I've built a custom risk ranking. It drives me to today, these 30 accounts have just showed up on my high risk kind of radar. I'm clicking into each one of those. I'm researching them, and I'm spending my time on a place that really kind of drives out most of the risk of my organization, because I'm always focused on the most critical, those triage people that are presenting that they're very dangerous. What do I do about them, and how I elevate it? Now, a part of that, if you kind of go through the process here, could be like we talked about client ID verification, right? And so we talked about like potentially if you're kind of wanting to dig in deeper and do ID verification, one of the ways you can do that, there's a product called Clear that does domestic coverage. I'm going to turn it over to my co-panelist here, Amanda. Why don't you kind of walk them through what some of the data points that Clear kind of looks at when they're trying to do ID verification, and then we'll go back and talk about some trends that you're seeing in IDV. So I'll turn it over to you, Amanda.
Yeah, sure. So happy to chat with you, Jeff, and definitely, support the view of, do you have a 360 look at your account? I talk to the world's largest financial institutions, to the startups, and everybody in between, the government regulators. I'm in front of everyone with our software, and identity is kind of critical. What you're seeing here in the Alessa platform right now is kind of, can I verify the subject that I just onboarded, a person or business? And frankly, globally, Jeff, more and more, it's just global. Can I verify them? And so what we're seeing here quickly is, does this subject and this will get into trends we're going to talk to, does this subject truly verify into records? I always give people 2 key questions, right? Is this a real person or business? And I always want to know in that question, is this a real person or business? What records validate for them? And we'll talk to kind of the fraud trends and the massive explosion of fraud. And then 2, did this person or business present the data? Because Jeff, you and I were talking about this. Let's be honest, guys, more and more is digital. There's not face-to-face events. Now, even in face-to-face, they might not really be the right holder of the data, but those are 2 critical identity verification questions you have to answer, guys. Is this a real person or business? Do they validate? And we're seeing flags all over the place on our fake subject here. And then we also want to know, who presented it. And I think those really drive to trends we're seeing. So we are going to show you a couple screens here. One is just the fact that identity theft is taking off. It really skyrocketed during COVID. And I already talked about kind of digital, the world's moved digital. We issued recently a white paper on the explosion of SARS. I personally think it might very well be tied to all the government money that came out of post-coronavirus, right? PPP and all the other ways we were giving money. Fraudsters did a lot of creativity to get their hands on stuff. And we're seeing that in the government criminal actions happening now as charging is starting all over the place. But the point is, fraud has exploded. I personally hear that firsthand. And so this is just a good look at how big it's gone. This is coming directly from the Federal Trade Commission, 88% increases, guys. So if you jump to the next slide, we have fraud plus the ability to create synthetic fraud. So one I think of as account takeover fraud, right? I'm a real person, right? Remember I said there were 2 questions, Jeff. Is this a real person or business? And did the real person or business present the data? Account takeover theft is a real person or business, but somebody hijacked their identity. And it's rampant right now. And I really would say fraudsters are early adopters on tech to do this. So if you are not talking to a vendor of kind of how to verify, you don't have account takeover fraud, there's a lot of ways to stop that. You can see it in the data. And then synthetic identity fraud, which kind of emerged around 2013, we're a decade into this. It's truly solvable, but it's the easiest fraud to commit. This is kind of like some real, some fake data exists in there. So Jeff, when you were showing, your subject on Alessa, there were plenty of identity clues, guys, on that subject on both real fraud and synthetic fraud that could have been triaged to make that a high risk account. And then just talking to high risk and kind of medium risk, low risk, I talked to a lot of accounts with general consumer banking customers. Everyone kind of considers that generic low risk. And I would entertain rethinking of your populations in general. One of the things you showed back on that screen that I'd want people to be thinking about is, and I see it, right? I hear this too. So, what is the company's key, what is their NAICS code, SIC code? What does my person that's presenting to me say they do? Does it pass a smell test to what they're presenting? This will really come to play when we talk more adverse media, but it's really pretty easy when you start thinking of what you've been presented with the data and how they're really transacting. Not all general consumer customers should be considered low risk. Let's just put it that way.
Amanda, we have a quick question.
Sure.
What data points would you recommend using to verify an identity?
I love that question because it's evolving over time. There was a time we all just said, PII is first name, last name, date of birth, social, your address. And by the way, absolutely, don't think fast onboarding is going to bypass solving fraud. And there's a lot of ways even fast onboarding guys can visibly make sure their PII is getting verified. But on top of that, Ashley, things like knowing the type of device, knowing their geolocation, emails, IP addresses, phones. Does the phone relate to the subject? So kind of your digital identity coupled with who you are. So it's an evolving space. Best practices are changing now, and now more and more. We have biometrics. There's just a lot happening here. But at a bare minimum, you're going to want first name, last name, date of birth, social, address on your US population, and even on foreign as much as you can get. I think those are pretty critical kind of have to haves here. And I think I'm going to turn it back to you, Jeff, as we went through this one to, have you pick up PEP screening.
Thank you for that, Amit. What we've done so far, obviously, we've kind of walked you through the trends, do more with less, and you need to automate. It's difficult to retain and hire. We talked about how risk scoring from a workflow can make you really efficient and drive up the engagement with your sales team, or sorry, with your compliance team, because they're really focusing on the most critical, and how IDV is a part of that. So, with fraud on the rise, part of the risk scoring model is obviously are people who they say they are, and Amanda kind of walked you through that. If you remember, one of the key elements of the risk scoring methodology was then PEP screening, right? So we're going to talk. We talked IDV, we're talking PEP screening, and then Amanda's going to talk a little bit about adverse media. So what I'm going to try to show you today is PEP screening can be very challenging, right? If you look at most of the available third-party databases, so your WorldChecks, your Dow Jones, the LexisNexis of the world, usually about a third of their database are PEPs, right? And they generate about 40% of the false positives. So if you've ever tried to figure out how do I screen efficiently, you know what it's like to be hit with a lot of false positives, very common sounding names, getting 42 hits and then trying to figure out is this the John Smith that I'm looking for. So people tend to think one of three paths for PEP screening. They screen against all PEPs, right? So they take their existing book of business, they screen it against all the WorldCheck PEPs or all the Dow Jones or all the Lexus. They load everything up and screen against it. Some people say, well, that's producing too many false positives. My team can't keep up. So we're going to pick and choose parts of the PEP database, right? So local PEPs or high-level PEPs, et cetera. And then there are clients that just turn all PEP screening off. They say, look, I know we'd like to screen for PEPs. We're supposed to, based on the size of my team, the workload, the number of false positive it kicks out. We just don't do PEP screening today. We just don't have the bandwidth to make that happen. So those are kind of the three different paths that we see people kind of entertaining in the world of PEP screening. So I would introduce a kind of a fourth path, if you will. So the way this could be done is really daily scoring of every single client record. So if you think about that workflow I showed you in Alessa, that could be done in your third-party filter as well, because every single kind of PEP can have a score assigned to it because you've got a customized risk score. What you could do then is make your screening match the risk level. Ideally, where you want to get in compliance is you spend the most time on the highest risk subjects, right? So you spend the majority of your time investigating people that present the greatest amount of risk to your company. And then you kind of have a really refined process. So for instance, what you'd want to do is, if someone's got a really high score, you're seeing unusual SAR activity, you're seeing kind of unusual transaction monitoring, there's things showing up and potentially in adverse media. If they're a PEP, you want to kind of spend your time looking after those subjects that are the highest risk. So if you have a client that's consistently spitting out a high risk score, run them against the full PEP data file. That makes perfect sense, right? They're presenting as potentially highly risky. You're really trying to see, is there any political exposure there? So they consistently show up on your high risk report because of the scoring. Run them up against the full PEP file. But let's say they're in the low and medium. You don't see anything unusual in transactions. Obviously, there's no sanctions exposure. You're not really doing a lot of SAR reporting. They just kind of blend in with the vast majority of your clients. Screen against a kind of a lower risk kind of PEP population where you're not going up against a full PEP data file. So if you think about it this way, high risk clients screen against more PEP data, low, medium risk screen against less PEP data. So that's the general principle, right? Because you don't necessarily have to screen everybody exactly the same. What the auditors and regulators really kind of favor is a risk-based approach where you're constantly assessing the risk in your business, and then you're making that match the screening experience that you do, right? So if you're a high risk client, then you're screening against the full PEP because you're trying to look for maximum exposure because you already have some concerns around this client. If they're low, medium risk, maybe you kind of refine what you're searching against. So if you're familiar, for instance, the World Check database, so they break all their PEPs down into different categories like PEP non-governmental, PEP national, PEP local, etc. So you could look at these kind of designations and for you figure out which of these give you the most concern, right? Are you most concerned about PEP nationals because they tend to have the most authority, they control the biggest budgets, they have, most interaction with foreign governments, etc. So we want to make sure that all of our high risk go against that. You may say, for locals, I'm not as concerned, right? If someone's the mayor of a mid-sized town with 20,000 people, we don't see that as being as risky as being, a senator or a congressman or someone that works for the International Trade, Commission, something like that, right? So really what you're trying to do is look at all the PEP categories and decide which ones do you think present the most risk to you. And so then what you could do is for your low and medium risk, right, you're kind of butting them up against the really highest risk PEPs, however you deem that to be. So if you think, national PEPs are the riskiest to you, then run your low and medium risk up just against that section. Your higher risk, run it up against the entire population, right? Because why this really matters is mathematics, right? So the average kind of third-party database out there, again, I'm talking World Check, Dow Jones, LexisNexis, they have somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million PEPs in their databases. So if you're running your list up against a list that big, greatly increases the chances that you're going to have a lot of false positives. If you remember, PEPs generate about 40% of the false positives typically that a client has to deal with. So if you can refine what you're doing on the PEP side, so high risk goes against more PEP data, low and medium, you kind of maybe refine and go against a smaller PEP list. What'll happen is mathematically then you'll have to deal with less false positives. So let me just kind of show you a little spreadsheet here to help you kind of understand how this could work, right? So let's say you've got 1.8 million, PEPs that you have in the database that you've purchased, World Check, Dow Jones, LexisNexis, and you're screening 100,000 existing clients, right? So typically, if you risk scored all your clients, so you remember when I showed you in Alessa there, everybody had a risk score, it got updated every night. You could do that in your existing third-party filter. Typically, it would break down to 10 to 12% of your clients at any given time would be high risk, 20, 22% would be medium, and the vast majority of your clients would be low risk. There's just nothing happening in their profile, list they're on, transactions that would indicate that they're anything higher than low risk. So what you see there of your 100,000 records, really only like a third of them would be high or medium risk. What you're doing today is if you're running it up against half of a PEP list, so let's say today I don't really have risk scoring in place and I'm running it up against half of my third parties, PEP file. So if they've got, 1.8 million PEPs in their file, I'm just looking at national and I'm looking at international. I'm not looking at local and subnational. I'm just looking at a percentage of the PEP because that's all I can keep up with. There's just so many hits that I'm getting, there's no way I could look at the full PEP file. Here's what we'd anticipate. On your 100,000 records, we would anticipate you'd get 4,000 false positives a year, right? So you'd be getting like roughly, 11 false positives a day that you're having to sort through, on your 100,000 accounts, running it up against a PEP file where you're looking at roughly half the PEPs in that file. So the question is, if I risk scored, could I save any time? So in this example, you're high risk, so that 10 to 12% of your population that you've deemed high risk because of your customized risk scoring methodology, you're running it up against the full PEP file. You're looking for every conceivable political exposure. You're looking at the relatives and connections and everything else. So maximum searching to try to really broaden your risk scope there. And then your mediums, maybe you're just looking at a segment, maybe a third. You're looking at PEP nationals, maybe international PEPs, et cetera. And then on your low risk, maybe you're just looking at PEP nationals on the highest level, whatever you deem to be the highest risk PEPs for you. What you can see, instead of getting maybe 4,000 false positives, you're getting 2,200. And that's because you're making the math work for you. So instead of treating everybody exactly the same, where all 100,000 get screened against 50% of the PEP population, you're starting to break that down a little bit. High against all the PEPs, and then you get into low and medium. You're only screening against a fragment of the PEP population, and by doing that, you're dramatically reducing the number of false positives you'd have to drive. And so what could that make sense for you in just in terms of time savings? You can see here, if you're doing 100,000 kind of clients today versus 50% of the PEP file, you'd be saving roughly 1,700 hits a year. Instead of the 3,200, you're down to 2,200. And if it's taking you 7 minutes to do each one of those kind of PEP reviews, you're talking about saving 200 hours a year. That's like 10% of a one-time full equivalent. So that's a substantial savings. And you may say, well, I have a lot more records than that. I actually have closer to 500,000 records. You go down here and you look at the math again, and now the savings become more substantial. Now you're close to almost 1,000 hours a year that you've saved. That's half of a full-time equivalent of a 2,000-hour employee. So then suddenly that 1,000 hours can be used for other things, like maybe adverse media, which we'll talk here in a second. You say, well, actually, I have a much bigger client file than that. I have about 1 million records, right? So if I started doing risk scoring in my PEP files, what would that mean for me? You can see here now you've saved a full one-person equivalent, 2,000 hours. And again, you're just using the math in your favor. So instead of running all 1 million records up against the full PEP file, you're starting to break that into pieces. So of my 1 million, 120,000 of them, I'm going to run against the full PEP file. 220,000, I'm going to run up against a third of the PEP file. And that remaining, that huge bulk that tends to be low risk for you, I'm only running that up against a fragment of the PEP file. And then now suddenly you can get back into doing PEP screening if you've turned it off or you've really limited it. And then you can show the auditor, look, like we have a risk-based approach. Our highest risk clients, we score them every single day. We run them up against maximum political exposure. And then as we work our way down the risk ladder, we screen against less PEP data, because based on the size of our team and how we want to spend our time, we're always trying to spend our time on the highest risk clients, spending our time there and resolving it. So this is like a practical way of how PEP scoring, if you look at getting a risk score for your clients every single day, can really determine what percentage of the PEP population you want to screen against. Maybe the high risk you screen daily, the low and medium you screen once a week. You can start looking at all those interval things, but it's all about doing more with less, so that the C-suite sees you doing more with less. And then more importantly, your employees feel like they're spending their time on the most critical things. They're really spending their time reducing those false positives on the lower risk and really chasing the high end of the ladder, the clients that you feel like present the most risk to you, really digging deep there and making sure you understand political exposure and who their immediate relatives are and what kind of organizations they're exposed to, et cetera. So that's practically like the math of how a risk scoring model can help you from just spending your time more efficiently and getting things done in a better way. Because if you can save time, one thing clients tell us they'd like to do more of is adverse media. So saving time, on this can free up time for adverse media. But Ashley, I believe you said there may be a question in the queue that we can answer.
Yeah, before we move to adverse media, there was a question here about, do people find more PEPs at the national level or the local level?
Great question. Yeah. So most databases, again, WorldCheck, Dow Jones, LexisNexis, there are a ton of PEPs at the local level. You think about all the local state and city kind of PEPs. So every single, town that's got, could be city council people, mayors, et cetera, assembly, men and women. There's just a lot of names in the databases for local PEPs, and that can really drive up your hit rate. So, you put in Dan Smith, he's one of your clients, you get 31 hits because Dan Smith's a common name. Turns out the Dan Smith that you're looking for is a mayor of a town in Utah with 14,000 people. You probably wouldn't deem that PEP particularly risky. So for instance, that may not be a PEP that you want to run every single day or run it up against the full file, et cetera. So just another practical example of risk scoring can help you determine how much of the PEP file that you want to screen against, because it's all about saving time to do more with less. Because if you can spend less time doing PEP screening, it can lead you down the path of PTAPs. A lot of people want to do adverse media screening, but it's overwhelming to them. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda now. She's going to do a couple of things. She's going to show you some trends of what she's seeing in the adverse media space, and then she's going to show you some new technology to help you keep up with adverse media, because we're keenly aware when you're doing your job every day and you're resolving hits, you don't always have the time to go out in the market and see new offerings and new technology. So Amanda's going to show you trends and then show you kind of some new kind of technology that could help you kind of refine adverse media searching. And so if you can save some time on PEP screening, shift some time to adverse media, and then build that more holistic approach you're really wanting to get in your program. So Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, perfect. Well, yeah, so let's tackle a couple key questions, everybody. What is adverse media? And we'll talk to what it is, when we think you should do it, and how you should probably be doing it today. I would love and encourage anyone to chat in questions, because we're definitely going to, share time at the end to take any questions. But let's just start with kind of what we found at Thomson Reuters when we scoped the market to even begin kind of trying to solve adverse media. So honestly, I think this survey is vastly underreporting how many people do adverse media. 67% is what we found when we talked to, certified financial crime specialists. And, what do we even mean when we talk about adverse media or negative news? It's a term of art, just like PEP is a term of art, right, Jeff? Like a politically exposed person. Really, you're trying to stop corrupt money coming in. That's really what you're solving, right? In the big, we want to make sure we don't have bad guys using our financial system to money launder, to wash their money, to commit more crimes. That's really what we're tasked with doing. And so when you're trying to find a PEP and confirm, are they using the accounts appropriately? And when you think back of adverse media, negative news, what it really means, and I kind of look to the Financial Action Task Force from, FATF kind of gave us guidelines, guys, when they said quite a while ago, has an account faced regulatory penalties or been investigated? Are there financial crimes you should be aware of? And typically it means something like Google, Bing. So if we jump to the next slide, let's talk about how painful this process is, Jeff. Like when you said, could we free up some time if we did smarter screening on determining if someone's high risk, right? Is this a subject that needs to go through enhanced scrutiny through, say, a PEP file? Or, what could be flagging in the account? If you think about a new key term, PKYC, perpetual KYC, it's kind of your duty to know the knowable. If there's one point I'm going to tell everybody to realize, your regulators are using the tech I'm talking about, you do have a duty to know the knowable. So what makes adverse media so hard right now is, gosh, you're in Google. Good God, good luck, right? You're in 10 pages of data. How do Jeff and I approach it? Probably differently, even if we got trained by the same person. Then let's start talking about how you even document it, because ultimately it's all in the paper trail in a highly regulated environment. The details like that matter. And, there's duplicates, the list goes on and on. It just seems so inefficient. And so, at least from my perspective, guys, as a product specialist at Thomson Reuters, I tackle anything we're trying to solve. And I say any vendor in the space certainly probably is doing the same thing, is asking, is this a problem I have? Is this really a problem I have? Like, you have to ask. And if it's really a problem you have, is there meaningful reasons to fix it? And if there was one thing I'd point out right now on adverse media, is I'm hearing from regulators, ask every type of account, how are you doing adverse media, right? And then I always our case study on why adverse media is critical is always going to be Jeffrey Epstein. It's always going to be. Every big bank touched that guy's money. And it was so knowable what he was doing from '08 forward, from his criminal cases in Florida and the news media accounting the human trafficking, the young girls. It was so widely known, right? And yet blind eyes turn to it right now. You just see a suit that just started up against JP Morgan. We know what Deutsche Bank had to do. I mean, there's been lots and lots of money thrown at kind of who banked Jeffrey Epstein. I always look to the consent order that came out of that case, Jeff, to say, you know, he got listed as heightened risk. He was deemed, let's just take his business banking, guys. So think about it. Let's just take his business accounts. And yet what flowed through there was cash payments to women, right? I mean, just repeatedly in the tunes of millions of dollars. So it just never made sense what was going on there. And I think that's a perfect scenario where adverse media could probably have picked up and, you know, documented the financial crimes that were probably taking place. But we're really here to say, kind of back to the knowable and the problems of, if you think of like how to do it fast and easy, that's really my mantra. Is there a way to do fast, easy adverse media searches? I would tell you to make sure you're just staying in front of what tech can do now. If the explosion of ChatGPT has taught us anything, is tech moves fast. And I speak at a lot of events. I was sharing with Alessa, you know, how much I've been doing this year. And honestly, I remembered giving a presentation quite a few years ago going, does anybody still fax? I mean, apparently banks, you guys still take the fax. But honestly, is that your best practice to do something now? Fax it? No. So adverse media has fully evolved. And let me just share my screen here. I think I can share now. Jeff, if you make me presenter, or did you already by chance?
Just hand it over to you now.
All right, so we're gonna walk through this really quick, everybody. And Jeff, tell me if you're seeing my screen by chance.
Yes, we're good.
Yes, we're good.
All right, I'm learning this transition on GoToMeeting, everybody. But back to the challenge, you know, is there a faster, easier way to spot adverse media? And what does the term mean? And how do I get to kind of a consistent approach with everyone? And goodness, documenting everything you're doing in Google. I'm going to run through a couple persons and businesses to show you how tech is probably fully solving this for you. So please stay in front, talk to your vendors, see what they're doing. I'm going to take ones that would be really hard to Google. Why would these be hard to Google? Well, these are common phrases. How am I going to find information on a company that I'm onboarding? And honestly, Jeff, I'm seeing more and more of adverse media being done as to know the reputational character of the account. This is pretty standard to see someone want to do a negative news query. Hey, is there anything out in open source I should know about? So what did I just do in 2 seconds? One, good luck Googling what I just, you know, did here within the Clear platform. But like I said, this is really just keeping you up to date on tech. I itemize quickly that there are risky stories tied to a business called Borrow My Ride. They're all very recent. These would not flow into public records with your vendors. This is a recent indictment for fraud tied to PPP lending, which is rampant, right? We had 200 billion in fraud that's now being investigated and charged. And if you notice on the left, everybody, there's scores. And so I can immediately understand if something's 90 or 80, I probably want to look at it. That's really AI in the big. Can I look at your term? Can I determine if there's financial crime, connectivity to it, and immediately alert you? And can I document it into a report and let you preserve it in an audit trail? And that's all been solved, right? This is stuff you can be talking to, you know, your vendors about doing, guys. So I immediately could spot there's probably a problem with the business I'm trying to do a loan for called Borrow My Ride. And I just, you know, it's hard for me to see because my left pane has all the GoToMeeting stuff going on. But the document has picked up all the articles, the time, date stamps, the URL, the hyperlink terms. It's all in here. And we're seeing 90% time savings over manual processes using this tech. So that was just one example. Let's just do 2 others quick, guys. And again, if we have questions, we definitely want to hear them. So let me run a person this time. And we're really going to talk to the person, because I think when Jeff was talking to false positives and how hard that is, I really want to talk to kind of how tech can help you all there too. So this person has a slightly unique name. I'm just going to run it against a query, an AI-based query, to find if there's negative news tied to the subject's name out there immediately. Rank it for kind of heightened risk, right? If there's a lot coming back that is 90s, I probably want to look at it. This is also running in every part of the globe, in every language, immediately auto-translating into English. It's not going to just instantly bypass paywalls, but it will grab whatever is essentially open sourceable. So, I mean, can be done on any person or business at this point in time. And it's just good to know that tech, because Jeff, I come to accountants telling me they're running the equivalent of like a 1985 query of 100 Boolean queries that they run against a particular type of terms and connector search. And it just feels really, really out of date and slow and painful. And there's really fast ways we could be solving that with just
It really it speaks to doing more with less, right? You just get to the heart of the matter quicker.
So the last thing I want to point out, guys, is kind of that name frustration. And Jeff, you picked out on it when you were talking about PEPs, right? False positives, how to know that. So I always like people to kind of get a little few nuggets of best practices. And there really is a best practice on screening. And I really think tech's going to help you a lot with even the false positive PEPs, guys. Keep with my mantra of more is more. There was a time name only mattered. That time has come and gone. Give us as much data as you have, because honestly, tech will alleviate the false positives that have no connection. Just because you're named John Smith does not mean you're the John Smith in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with a certain age. So the more we have, the more tech can solve that. So if I have this kind of common name, which is not uncommon, right? Her name's Kimberly Coleman, but I know she's in Arizona. I mean, this is going to do a cleanup for you. So there's so many ways, thinking of more is more, to start addressing the false positives you see everywhere and get you much closer to kind of knowing the knowable, if that's really what it's coming down to. I recently onboarded Jeff, a very big regulator, into this tool. And as I was training the analysts, we were doing things on this particular query, like running addresses, running digital coin, anything I could think of in that search box, to see if it's risky. And it's truly findable. And there's probably a really easy way to kind of roll out a consistent process to the team. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, which means I have to make you presenter again, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, so Amanda, thank you for that. And you're seeing how these things tie together, right? If you can use risk scoring to become more efficient, then that allows you to spend your time on the most important, highest risk subjects. It allows you to have a refined PEP screening process, and those two things in conjunction could free up enough time that you could start using an adverse media tool like the one that Amanda just showed you. So as we think about these 3 trends and kind of wrapping these things all together, you're asking to do more with less, to automate your processes, and then it's very difficult to retain and hire the right people for your team. Everything we tried to show you today, starting with the foundational principle, risk ranking helps you spend your time on those subjects that present the most risk to your company. So that alone helps you communicate to the C-suite, look, we're doing more with less. We're concentrating our firepower where there is the most risk to our business, and that's how we choose to spend our time. More importantly, then we can automate those processes, right? So we have a nice clean workflow. And then your employees have increased engagement because they're no longer clicking through, alert after alert for false positives around a PEP alert, and then they end up getting to it, and it's a mayor of a small town in Utah, when you could have said, you know what, even if it is a small town mayor in Utah, we probably wouldn't care anyway, because we don't view that as a high risk PEP, right? So the whole notion of starting with risk scoring and then moving into a workflow, and then that risk score can determine what percentage of the PEP population you're screening against, so that every single day your employees are getting fewer and fewer and fewer and false positives, and they're feeling like how I spend my time really helps protect my company, and I'm using my research and my analytical skills on those subjects that really are the highest risk, and I'm spending less and less time on those clients that we deem low and medium risk. And the numbers will show risk scoring usually produces where 80% of your client base will be low and medium risk. So if you can spend less time false positives on that population and more time researching the top 20% that you've deemed as the highest risk for you, you're more efficient, you're using your head count better, your budget better, the CFO feels like you're running a really efficient team, and then more importantly, your employees feel that satisfaction of I'm coming in every single day, I'm doing that triage work, I'm the front line of the emergency room, and I'm determining which of those kind of people get to go to see a doctor and which ones don't, which ones need more kind of research and which ones don't. That's going to drive up their engagement. They're going to feel like their work is more efficient and more meaningful. So everybody wins. And the things that we're showing you today, I know they sound very practical, but risk scoring, refined kind of PEP screening, and a really highly engineered technology-driven adverse media tool, finance wins and your employees win because they're more engaged. So we're hoping today was some good practical down on the road, not high level theories. And this is really practical. How do you get more done with less, protect your company, and then have employees that are more engaged?